We're gonna call this meeting to order. It's a call meeting with Dave Wills and his group on the EMS assessment.
I'm going to defer just for a moment to Curtis Railtail.
My name's Chris Railtail. You remember me from when we conducted your on-site assessment back in July. And so we're here tonight to present this assessment report to the Jeff Davis County Board of Commissioners. And in doing so, I just want to take a minute. We've distributed out the report to you. A lot of care has been taken in preparing this report specifically for Jeff Davis County Commissioners. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes to get you kind of acclimated to the composition of the report itself. But to begin with, you initially requested to the Office of EMS to conduct an assessment for Jeff Davis County. That assessment was approved by the Office of EMS in Trumbull, for which I'm employed. We also partner with the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, as you well know, Dave Wills. But upon your request, we were asked to conduct an assessment for Jeff Davis County and pay particular attention to examine the overall operations of the county's EMS system based on management, cost, economy, and efficiency. And so the assessment team, in anticipation of the on-site visit, we have requested from Jeff Davis County numerous records and documents, both from the county as well as the EMS operations. And so the committee has examined all of those documents, the financial documents, operational documents specific to the EMS operation that included the structure and the scope of the service, the financial management, and key performance indicators. But as we go through the report, I want to invite you, give you an opportunity at any point in time to ask questions, both on the front end, during the presentation of the specifics of the report, and as well as on the back end of the report. I also want to note that one of the things that stood out to me initially was the stability of the emergency medical services. You've got an employment that is long tenured, which indicates to us that they're very committed to their jobs and to the emergency medical services system and for the patients for which they provide what we think extraordinary care too. So I just wanted to note that on the front end of it. So just to look at, if you open up your manuals or your report to page 2, is a list of the table of contents along with findings and recommendations as we go through this report, in particular with Dave. And Dave, I would say, is the primary author of this report. He spent a tremendous amount of time in preparing it. And so going over to page 3, you'll be referenced as we go through the report, a list of different charts and tables in there, and so it has the page numbers for which those charts and tables reside. Over on page 4 is a list of recommendations. As we conduct the assessment, we want to come back to sort of drill it down into specific recommendations for each area that we examine. And so you'll see, if you look through that list later and even through tonight, for a specific recommendation for a specific area, you'll see the page number where that recommendation resides. And if you'll go over to the page number 42 in the appendix, we've got listed a number of different websites, and some of them I think that you'll find extremely beneficial and helpful not only to you, but the leadership of the Emergency Medical Services as well. That first one there is the official site of the Georgia Office of EMS and Trauma. If you go to that website, if you're looking down the left-hand side of the page, you'll see a number of different links. And that's where you'll find the rules and regulations, the state statutes, for the regulation of the Emergency Medical Services. You'll find other resources with forms and documents, training information, for example, with the scope of practice. If you want to know what a paramedic can do, what is within his scope of practice, you can easily bring up that document and look at that. Applications, for example, with the licensing application for the ambulance service, that document is on there. And then another real useful information that is on that site. The second website is the official site for the Georgia Association of Emergency Medical Services. And then the third one is the Georgia Trauma Network Commission. The Trauma Network Commission, will mention that later in the report as it pertains to. That is the group that funds the EMS and Directors Leadership and Management course. Coming down towards the bottom of the page, you'll see a website that says the National Association of State EMS Officials. The Director Wages, Keith Wages, who is the Director of the Georgia Office of EMS and Trauma, and my boss, Keith is very involved with that association. As a matter of fact, he is the president-elect of that national association. I think it's a credit to him and what he has accomplished in having a representative from Georgia leading that organization. I think is a compliment to the department as well. And then in particular for the EMS service, that next website, for the Georgia Hospital Alliance website, is a number of good, valuable resources that's available at that website as well. So moving on to, you'll see your numbered tabs that you have. Those are attachments. There's 22 attachments contained in this book, and throughout the presentation of this document, we'll be referencing those tabs and make it a little bit easier for you to identify those, look at them tonight, as well as after we leave, as you begin to study this document more, and hopefully you'll begin to implement a lot of the recommendations that we've made. And I believe that if you do so, that you begin to see some immediate changes within your operations of your emergency medical services system. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Dave Wills.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. We do appreciate the opportunity to be back and to present the report. When I came many months ago, and you asked initially about having an assessment done, I distinctly remember your primary question because it was so different from what we were accustomed to hearing. Chris and I had worked together since 2009, along with a series of other people on doing assessments, and invariably, until the report that we produced for you, the question was always predicated on how much EMS cost. Your question was specifically, are we staffing our EMS correctly? That was the question that you asked. I want to give you an answer to that right on the front end, and the answer is you are staffed very well. We are not making any recommended changes to your staffing model. You currently are using what we referred to on page 17 as a modified 24/48 schedule. Arguably, you could say it's a 24/72. But your EMS works with a crew on duty 24 hours a day. And that same crew then rotates off to an on-call basis where they work 24 hours, or they're available to work for 24 hours. And then they have 48 hours off. And that cycle repeats itself. So it has worked very effectively for you all, and it basically does meet the needs of the community. So in order to establish the reason that we make that recommendation to not change your staffing model, I want to first direct your attention to tab 4 in your book. So if you'll turn to tab 4, and for the benefit of the audience, what they're looking for on the first page of tab 4 is on your screen. This is the first page of a demand analysis. This is for Sunday. A demand analysis, in this case, is predicated on 20 weeks worth of data. This is actual call data from your EMS that was logged into the Georgia Georgia EMS Information System, Genesis. So your staff logged this information in, it was extracted and then used to build this demand analysis. So you can see in the top left-hand side, it says week 1, the date is April the 5th of 2015. And then to help you understand, if you hadn't already intuitively figured it out, 00 is midnight. And then moving to the right, you have each sequential hour. So you can see on April the 5th, EMS here did not receive its first call until the 1 o'clock hour. And then you can see, moving further to the right, another one at 6, a call at 9, and a call at 10. That's the premise. So you can see that everywhere there's that light yellow color, there was a call that was placed to EMS. And that was logged into the system. You can see in the pink shade where there are 2 calls, and then if you look, there's one that's designated with a black color. It was more than 2 calls, it was 3. So the reason it's important to understand that is because the recommendations that we are making are not predicated on anecdotal information. This is actual data that was used to build the demand analysis. So, Gary, if you'll advance the slide, if you'll turn one page, you'll see that same data that is represented graphically. So the designation of 1, 2, and 3 is the number of units. And you see the bold blue line, the fixed staffing unit at 2, and you can say, well, we don't really have 2 trucks. Yes, you do. You've got a truck where you've got 2 medics who are ready to go at the drop of a hat, and you've got 2 more who are on call and who are being compensated for being on call, and they are available. So your staffing model is, in essence, 2 trucks. So this graphically represents the demand that occurs or did occur on each Sunday during that 20-week period. So you're averaging this out. Now, I want to be very clear that the demand probability chart, which we're going to look at in a minute, and the demand analysis does not predict when a call is going to occur, and it does not predict how many calls might come in a fixed period of time. Instead, we're looking back in time, and because 20 weeks is statistically valid, we can say, and if you want to take this out further, you could do a year's worth of study, but 20 weeks is the period that is determined to be statistically valid, that you can predict with relative certainty that in a fixed period of time, you're going to have this number of calls. So, Gary, if you will, just flip through to the Monday chart. If you want to turn in your book, there is a chart like this for every day of the week for this 20-week period. And I'm not going to dwell on it because I think you understand what to do. If you just go ahead to Tuesday and let it sit on Tuesday for maybe a few seconds and then scroll through the balance of them, you'll see that with one exception during this period, your existing facilities, now if you'll pause right there. So when you see at that 12 o'clock hour, when you've got the bar runs beyond 2, that's an indicator that the demand upon your resources was greater than you can meet. Now, that could be the case, and I want to point this out too. A call that's logged into the system means that somebody was transported. So it could be that there was a call made to EMS, there was a car accident, your unit was dispatched, and there were 2 victims who were injured, and they were both put on the same truck and taken to the hospital. That would show up as 2 calls. So just because we show 2 calls doesn't mean that 2 units were dispatched. So I want to make sure that that's clear. You can go ahead to Friday and Saturday. So you can see that for the vast majority of time, your resources are adequate. Now, in those instances where your resources are not adequate, you have mutual aid agreements in place, or otherwise you're going to have somebody to respond. I do want to direct your attention now that you've had a chance to look through that to page 27 in your report. You'll turn there. at the top of the page is the demand probability for 20 weeks. In a 20-week period, there are 3,360 hours. And again, this is based on that 20-week period starting in April and ending in August. For 2,693 hours, out of that 3,360, there were 0 calls to EMS. So for 80% of the time, just over 80%, there were 0 calls. That means that your unit is sitting idle, available for call, but not engaged in a transport or call. You can see that the hours with 1 call was 605, which represents just over 18% of the time. So our recommendation to stay with the staffing model you have is predicated primarily on this data. It's saying that 98+% of the time, you have 1 call or 0 calls. That's a very high amount. You can look down at the third line. Only for 56 hours out of that period of time was there a second call. In other words, a second transported patient, representing 1.67%. And then the hours with 3 calls or more was only 6 hours out of that entire period. So you can see that for 98% plus of the time, 1 unit is available to meet your demand. That does not mean that you don't need that second on-call unit. You do. There always are those instances, and I'm sure your medics would tell you that there are anomalies out there. You're going to have back-to-back-to-back calls. They come in within a few minutes and you don't have enough resources. But none of us can afford to pay for the very highest level of care. So let me put it in this context. If you could afford to pay for the highest level of protection for all of your citizens, you would hire 1 deputy and 1 medic to go with everybody in Jeff Davis County everywhere they went. That way they would be protected. They've got an armed bodyguard and they've got somebody by their side in case something happens to them. But you can't afford that. And I would also suggest to you that even having a paramedic standing by your side won't necessarily save your life. There was an incident that happened in the metro Atlanta area a couple of years back. I think it was in Cobb County, but I remember reading about it in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where an accident occurred and an ambulance unit went to the scene, and one of the medics got out to begin working the accident scene, and he had a heart attack, and they could not save his life. Those things happen. It's just a fact of life, so to speak. So the challenge for you is to provide the level of service that you can afford, that you think represents the best value for your citizens. And we think the data shows that you have a very good system with regard to the way that it's being staffed. So we are not making any recommendations to change the model that you're currently working with. Now, having said that, as we were here back in July, and we talked to your director, your assistant director, to your medics, we talked to your billing director, we talked to Chief Wasden and others that were involved, anybody that was really related, including your medical director. We talked to all of those individuals, and we received a lot of information, and we made a commitment then that what they told us would be kept in confidence. In other words, if you told us something that you didn't want shared by attribution to you, we promised not to do that. But there were a number of questions and issues that were raised, and as we proceeded to study the information that was given to us, it raised additional questions, which then led to more questions on our part. And so we were actually engaged up until just a couple of weeks ago in getting more information. So we would ask, we would study, it raised new issues for us, we would ask for more information. So in that context, I want to say a special word of appreciation to Kathy Lord. Time and again, as we had questions, Chris and I would confer and say, well, who is it that has that information or likely has that information? Who should we ask for it? And so we would often ask Kathy, and she was gracious to give us information if she had it. And in many cases, she did. So the balance of this report primarily is to talk about other issues that we identified, which we think are important for you to hear about and to address. So the first point I want to make, if you want to turn over to page 18, is that in the context of how you provide for managerial oversight in your EMS, In essence, what you're doing, and this is right under the payroll chart, the first paragraph, you are paying a supplement, in essence, for management. So your director and your deputy director are paid respectively just over $3,700 and then almost $1,900 a year. So they go out, they work their hours, they get paid for that, they get the supplement. And we would suggest that you are paying relatively small amount of money for management. You've often heard it said that you get what you pay for. That's not always true, but we know that in many cases it is. And we believe, as a team, that you are paying a very modest amount for what you should be getting in service. If you're truly getting the service that you need, it's probably worth a lot more than the amounts that you are currently paying for management. Now, having said that, we've identified a number of issues that need to be addressed, and I'll start with the EMS license renewal. If you want to turn over to page 34, and then I'll point out some specifics in that regard. The State Office of EMS requires that the license for your EMS operation be renewed once every 2 years. The license fee itself is paid on an annual basis. So you're paying an annual fee, but you're renewing every 2 years. In 2010, this is in number 4, on page 34, you see the designation of the paragraph starting with number 4. In 2010 and in 2012, Jeff Davis EMS did not renew the license before it expired. Now, I want to let that sink in just a minute. It did not renew before it expired. You can't legally run an ambulance service without a license. And what's also critically important is that you cannot bill Medicaid and Medicare without being a licensed provider. So once it lapsed, somebody had to jump through the hoops and make sure that everything got renewed and then submitted, and it was a problem. It's a protracted process to get reinstated. And there's absolutely no excuse for that. This is something that we also make a recommendation about, and that is to say that your director, who is responsible primarily for renewal of the license, should have an established process so that 90 days out, 60 days out, you're reviewing information, you're submitting all the proper documentation so that you get your license renewed well in advance so that you can submit the proper documentation to the insurers, the Medicaid and Medicares of the world, those sort of folks, so that you don't have a lapse. At best, it represents, this failure to renew represents a challenge to you financially when you can't collect for patients who you are transporting and you suffer a cash flow crunch because the money's not coming in the door, and yet you're continuing to provide the EMS service, which obviously costs money. In 2014, the only reason that you didn't have a full lapse was because of what I believe to be an extraordinary move on the part of the Deputy Director for the State Office of EMS, when he granted 4 days before the expiration of your license, he granted a temporary license. And even with that being done, because it was so close to the expiration, you still got kicked out on Medicare and had to be reinstated. So we strongly recommend that your administrator work with your director to make sure that there is a solid process in place, that there is a process that creates accountability so that you don't risk having your license lapse in any future year where it should be renewed. This is something that's easily avoided just simply by having good, solid management practices in place. It could be as simple, and Gary, I don't know what system you use, but it can be as simple as logging into your Outlook calendar so that you know that 90 days ahead, hey, here's my reminder. 60 days ahead, has this been done? Have we got the paperwork? So that it's getting submitted to their office. This is, in my view, something that can be easily rectified, but it should not happen again.
One question.
Yes, sir.
2014, 4 days before it was going to lapse, that the state director notified us, correct?
There was a request that was made, in essence, by Kathy Lord to the State Office of EMS, and it was the deputy director who issued the temporary license. I will point out, if you want to review the data, and it's voluminous, but the data is, the supporting documentation is in your books from tab 6 through tab 20. All of those tabs are related to the expiration or near expiration of the license. And there is a document in there showing the temporary license being granted.
Okay, so the Kathy Lord notified them, and we got the extra 4 days. But the 2 times before in 10 and 12, they were not notified, so automatically, they don't notify you when your license is going out. It's for your responsibility to get it done, correct? Is that what
I'm
you're?
going to ask Chris to join me in talking about what he does in his region. And Robert Shad is your program director. The two of them can address that better than I can about process.
What our customary process is for notifying the ambulance service provider that their license are going to be up for either renewal or anniversary. As Dave mentioned earlier, there's an annual license fee. When we issue a license, they're good for 2 years. But because there's an annual license fee, there has to be activity on the license for each year. And it always is preceding the expiration date. So for the actual renewal year, historically, we send out a notice, and we try to get that notice out to the ambulance service director or whoever is listed on the license application as the authorized agent. I would say 99.9% of the time, it is the EMS director who is listed as the authorized agent. So we send a notice by email to the EMS director and notify them that their license is up for renewal. We give specific instructions on where the license renewal application resides on the State Office of EMS website. We strongly recommend that, at least in my region, I would probably speak for his region, but we strongly recommend that we receive that renewal package at least 30 days in advance. I request in my region that I get it 45 days in advance. And the reason that we do so is that we give you time to prepare it, you submit it to our office, we have to review it for completeness, make sure that all the fields are filled in, and then from our office it goes directly to the State Office of EMS in Atlanta. They're the licensing and compliance law officer. They conduct a review, verify the payment, and then once that's completed, the license is issued, signed by the director of the state office, and then forwarded to the ambulance service director. Once they receive those licenses, then it's their responsibility to notify the CMS or the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that you now have a valid license. It keeps you in the program. It keeps your reimbursements in a timely manner. Failure to do so, it can bump you out of the system and delay your reimbursement. So it's time sensitive. And that's why we send the notice out in 90 days in advance. And I think Robert has the same similar practice for doing so. And at the same time, the ambulances have to be inspected at least one time each year. So when we send that notice for the license to be renewed, regardless of whether it's an anniversary update or actual license expiration date, we set up a time where we can come and inspect those ambulances, so they have to be done at least once a year. So that's our process.
And if it's due, say it's renewed every other year and it's November, so you would know it's the same time every other year, correct?
They expire the same date. If your license, I can't remember if it's November or.
I think it's in May.
If May, what if it's May the 15th, then it's always going to be May the 15th, regardless of whether that falls on a weekend day or not. That's why we try to give you notice ample time. But, even though we do that as a courtesy from the State Office of EMS, it's just like your driver's license. It is your responsibility to maintain that license.
Again, I think this is very easy to overcome. Chris, you can just remain up. I think it's very easy to deal with. This is something that administratively, you plug it in your calendar, you have a reminder, you get the paperwork filed. Shouldn't be any issue in fixing this problem going forward. I'm going to ask Chris to speak about 3 different subjects, and then I'll come back and address the remainder of the report.
I'm going to talk just a minute with regard to the management or support of the local EMS management staff for education and training. It's one of those, I think, a necessary evil. You know, we all have to complete continuing education. And in particular, with all levels of EMTs, regardless of if you're an EMT, if you're a cardiac technician, advanced EMT, or paramedic, all levels are required to obtain 40 hours of continuing education over the course of a 2-year period. Of that 40 hours of continuing education, 20 hours are specific. There's 8 hours required specifically in pediatrics. There's 4 hours that are required specifically in cardiac, and 4 hours specifically in trauma. And I think that beginning in January, there's going to be 4 additional hours required for infectious disease precautions. It's an area that, you know, we feel is important, especially in light, you know, some of the influenza that's being spread around, the risks that it poses to the medics for the protection of themselves, to create that barrier. So it's important that they obtain those continuing education for their benefit, to keep them abreast of the new trends, regardless of if it's new treatment, new medications, changes in CPR, advanced cardiac life support, all of those different things. It's important to stay abreast of that. And it's important for them to retain their license. Again, it's their responsibility to do that. But we see around the state, not just for communities like Jeff Davis County, it's a challenge in more rural areas to obtain that continuing education. When we met with the staff at the EMS, that was one of the things that they brought attention to, was the lack of the ability to obtain those continuing education credits in-house. So our recommendation is that you support the ambulance service and those staff with obtaining continuing education. The majority of it can be done in-house, and but we also know that they do not have a designated training officer. I think there's a willingness of some of the medics, certainly the capabilities, to do that in-house to help reduce the cost to Jeff Davis County and providing continuing education, training opportunities. And it's just it's not a very cumbersome process. In order to conduct a in-house training program on that website that I mentioned to you earlier, there's just a one-page form that you can go to, download that form, fill that form out, and because you have a local medical director, your medical director should be engaged with your continuing education opportunities as well. And that's one of the things that we spoke to the medical director about when we met with him, is he has a willingness to engage and participate in providing some of the continuing education. So I would encourage you to engage him and let him provide that education or continuing education to the service. And what that does also, it gets him more familiar with your medics because, you know, he has a large responsibility. He has to prove, you know, even the treatment protocol. So he has a willingness to do that. I think it's important. It'll cut down your costs in addition to perhaps appointing someone within the organization on a regular basis, whether you do it on a monthly basis, whatever schedule that you set up. They would greatly benefit by having opportunities to get that continuing education credits. We, the State Office of EMS, up until just a few months ago, we had on our website what we call the EMS Classroom. And it was loaded with a number of different continuing education offerings. But we are in the process of changing the platform that it operates on. It was an independent system. The thing had issues, and we recognized that. And so we have worked out an agreement with the Georgia Public Safety Training Center to let our EMS classroom operate off of their learning management system through there. It's much more reliable. It's going to provide many more opportunities to obtain that training. It is free. There's no cost to it whatsoever. But it's still, even with that, we think that there is a need to have someone doing that in-house, specific to this area, specific to the needs of Jeff Davis County EMS. And I'll bring your attention to attachment number 21. If you wanted to move forward with trying to identify someone, there's a draft or generic job description for a field training officer. I won't read this to you. It can be modified in any way that you desire. I can send to you the electronic Word document so that it'd be easy for you to tailor that specific for Jeff Davis County.
There wouldn't be some way that Jeff Davis, Coffee, Athens, or, maybe 3 other counties or whatever, that it would be cheaper than us sending people out of town to get trained, plus they not being able to work while they missing time off. If there was a regional training, or, like maybe 5 counties, and the state has someone on board that they send down, and the 5 counties splits the cost of it, and then we turn around and have our local people, and, people not having to drive over 30 miles to get that training than it is to have to do it the other way.
Yeah, that works. And as a matter of fact, there's models like that across the state where that 2 or 3 adjoining counties, adjoining providers, they get together and they share their resources and provide that training opportunity to each other. To include your hospitals as well. They offer a number of different continued education opportunities through the hospitals. Sometimes you just contact the right person, let them know that you're interested, get on their email distribution list to be notified when they have those training opportunities, and then they send it out and you plan to go. At least in my area, we've got competing hospitals there, and they're wanting to provide training opportunities to the EMS, and some of them do a very good job with it and make it more than worth your time to go there and give you a great meal in the process too. Staying on also with training opportunities, more specific to the management staff, and I think I had mentioned this the last day of our on-site visit with regard to the EMS Director's Management course. This is a great course. Both Robert and I attended that class together. It was actually the initial course that was provided through the Georgia Trauma Network Commission. That course, I think they contributed a little over $100,000 to that course. They have an enrollment class is limited to 25. So it's a great course. Even for EMS directors, managers, supervisors, it doesn't matter if you've been in that role for a year or 20 years. There's something for you. It is a great course. It is Georgia Southern University has gotten involved with it from the very beginning, and they continue to stay involved with it. And it consists of 4 weeks. It's over the course of 8 months, but you're in class for a week at a time. You go to class, and the first one will be at Georgia Southern University. The application process for that should be available by December 31st, if not right after the first of the year. But the class will meet in March, August,
March, May, August, and September.
yeah, March, May, August, September. I think the September is going to be maybe the last or the first week in November. They're trying to negotiate those locations, but it'll initiate, out of Georgia Southern. So you'll spend a week in class, and then the 2-month interim period, you have, assignments, interim assignments to be completed between. So it's a great course. It provides some excellent operational aspects, leadership aspects, reimbursements, ambulance maintenance. I mean, it goes through A to Z with regard to EMS operations. And I'm just going to hand this off to you. You can get this information right here, and if that website is provided in your book there, that is copies of the talks about the management class. But also another opportunity for the directors is coming up in March. Is the Director's Leadership and Management course. I know that they sound similar, but they're different. This is a 3-day course, and that is a really good training session for your leadership and management, for your EMS. It costs a little bit of money, but I think it would be worthwhile to you. So that information is in there as well. Both of those courses, you can get additional information if you go to the GAMS website.
Back up to the trauma, you go to Georgia Southern 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, or whatever the class is, 5 classes.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next 2 trainings, is that it, or 3? Is it weekly, or what is it?
Yeah, the first class will be at Georgia Southern, it's 5 days, that's the initial one. The next 2 classes, they're separated by 2 months apart. The next class, I'm not sure of the location of those. The first week is at Georgia Southern, the last week of class is at Georgia Southern.
The 2020, but it's 4 weeks.
It's 4 weeks, total 4 weeks, that's right. That includes interim assignments between, the week that you're actually in class.
One of those other weeks is typically held in Macon. I'm not sure about the third one, but one of them usually is in Macon.
Yeah, the other one is in Gainesville. And the one in Gainesville, it may be moved, but it's just, they're still trying to work out arrangements for that. And the good thing is this course is relatively little to no cost to you. The Georgia Trauma Commission sponsors the class. Your tuition is paid, your travel is paid, your meals are paid, your accommodations are paid. Each county is permitted one. You have 2 managers here with your ambulance service, and because we feel like that there is legitimate need here, and I hope and desire, I contacted GAMS, spoke to them about it. They think that they can accommodate 2 for Jeff Davis County, with the only exception of being that they have to pay part of the travel costs if they can't cover the full cost. It just depends on the number of applications that they get. So it'll be contingent on that. And if you're interested, let us know, and we can let GAMS know that we certainly have you secured for 1 slot, but we may can get 2. The last area that I want to address is participation in the Region 9 EMS council meetings. And you can look on, in the recommendations on page 36, it'll give to a little more detail about these 3 topics under section 2C. But with regard to the Region 9 EMS council meeting, that is a group of representatives made up of all of the 27 counties, Robert, in Region 9. There are representatives from each county that has a seat on that council. 2/3 of the voting majority on that council has to be representatives from county boards of government. The other 1/3 to add to those disciplines that you wouldn't typically be able to get represented from a county or from an ambulance service with regard to physicians, nurses, community lay people, and that sort of thing. but 2/3 of it is made representatives of county boards of government. We know that for Jeff Davis County, they do have a representative on the council, and it is one of their staff paramedics. We think that it's essential that the leadership of the ambulance service participate in those quarterly regional council meetings. There are a lot of important topics that are discussed, all aspects of EMS operations, not only just EMS operations, but emergency preparedness, communication, and so on and so forth. So we've encouraged participation by the leadership on that quarterly Region 9 council meeting. Robert sends out notifications when they meet on a quarterly basis. I think that's all I have. Do you got any questions before I turn it back over to Dave?
I'll ask you to turn, if you will, over to page 32. And if you look about midway to the page, you'll see designated as B, administrative issues, and number 1, where we talk about patient care reports. These may be referred to variously as PCRs, or patient care reports, or 60-second forms, as in 60 seconds being a minute. And one of the things that we heard when we were here back in July, we were told by multiple sources that the director completed fewer of his PCRs than all of the other medics together. And not being one who accepts at face value things that are said like that, we began to ask for, and we subsequently received, documentation. So for the months of August, September, and October of this year, we received 112 PCRs that were completed by the director. What we found was that none of them were completed, in essence. Every one was incomplete. But to be able to say how that compares, we wanted to see what other medics were doing. So we requested and received a sample from all other medics, both full-time and part-time. These were completed in the months of September, October, and November, and we reviewed 136 PCRs from the other medics. So we compared 112 by the director to 136 by all of the other medics. If you turn to the last tab in your book, the very last tab, you're going to find 4 examples, and I know that's relatively few, but they are representative of what we found. In that tab, on the very first page, and you'll see that relevant information has been redacted so that you can't see a patient's name or response number. We didn't want to provide any information that would violate anybody's right to privacy. But you will see that there is very little that's recorded on that form. There's not even a date of service. If you look at the top right-hand corner, the date of service was not complete. The dispatch, en route, on scene times up under that were not completed. They were not filled in. And there's very little information about the patient other than standard things like respiration and pulse rate, blood pressure. Now, if you turn another page, in fact, for the next 3 pages, you will see PCRs that were completed by other medics. And I think that you'll recognize from looking at those, that there's a very stark contrast. The medics there were providing significant information about all the details, not only those things that are required like a date of service, but those things that are relative to the patient, what was being done, what the complaints were. And as I've heard, and I don't work in EMS, but I've heard my friends in EMS say, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And that's true in the context of how you bill. You can't bill for something you didn't do. If you didn't write it down, you don't have documentation, you can't bill for it. And so, at the very least, what we believe is that the failure to complete the PCRs represents either a lack of understanding about their importance, or at worst, an attitude that says it really doesn't matter. And that's clearly not the case. your EMS, like all EMS operations, is highly dependent upon the revenue that comes in the door for the service you provide. And if you can't bill adequately for it, then you are shortchanging yourself. You're shortchanging the taxpayers of the county if you have to put more general fund money in to support or subsidize the operation. Now, what we believe to have been the case is that oftentimes when these incomplete reports were submitted, that somebody else was going behind and trying to get enough information to be able to bill. I can't quantify that because I don't have that information, but it clearly does indicate that there is room for or opportunity for an improvement in the documentation. And in part, that's related to the recommendation concerning a training officer. Chris spoke about it from a different perspective. A training also takes place in the context of not only initiation of new employees, and this is addressed in the report itself, but in periodic updates for those even very seasoned medics who have been around a long time could benefit from a refresher from time to time on how to complete these documents in a proper way. So we want to point that out. On page 33 and 34, this is at the bottom of the
Okay, well,
page.
yes, if I can ask a question. If they two own the ambulance, then which one is it that has to have the responsibility to fill this out?
Historically, it is the medic that attends the patient.
Attending to the patient?
That's right.
So the other one would be driving, and so the one that was right with the patient, he would know what he's administrating and doing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Both of them has the responsibility, of the bulk of the responsibilities on the shoulders of the attendant. She's the one that actually provides patient care
Yeah.
during transit.
Transit.
Both provide care while on scenes, but during transit, one in the back continues that care. Both are responsible for signing the report.
If you turn over to page 33, look about 2/3 of the way down at number 2, we talk about the Georgia Emergency Management, I keep saying emergency management, the Georgia EMS Information System. One of the things that we found when we were here back in July was that initially our review showed that only about 600 EMS calls had been logged into your system at that time, but the actual number of calls responded to was about 1,200. So we addressed that with Tony, your deputy director, while we were here, and we noted that in the weeks that followed, that information was caught up to date. We do make a recommendation that that information be kept up to date on a regular basis, that it not get behind. If you're going to engage in data-driven analysis and management decisions, you have to have that information available so that it can be pulled and analyzed and used to help improve your operations.
See, that's one of the problems that I had, that we showing that sometimes they look at 1 call or 2 calls a day, and that if they're not at the station and get called, and you get to that place, then checking somebody, even if it's for sugar or blood pressure or whatever, you can't leave and go to another call to that patient that you know is okay and not going to the hospital or whatever. So then that's a lot of difference between 600 and 1,200. And they may not have been at the station to get dispatch out if they had went to one of these other calls.
Regardless of whether they transport the patient or not,
Yeah.
when a electronic report or a report is expected to be created on all requests for assistance. If they crank that truck up and they're dispatched to it, they have to generate a call regardless of whether they transport a patient or not.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question to clarify on that? Sir, you're saying that there was somewhere a lapse of 600 reports that was not documented?
At that time, when we were here, Dan Gates, who was a member of our team, went into the Genesis system, and he told us that there were only about 600 calls that had been logged in at that point. We questioned Tony about that. He told us that he was behind some. We didn't quantify that, but what we showed comparatively was that there had been about 1,200 calls, but only about 600 had been logged into the system. That was caught up to date. And I'm giving credit where credit's due in that case. We discovered that we were behind, so to speak. Tony went in, I don't know how long it took, but I did check with Dan later, and he said that it had been caught up to date, or it appeared to be that way. So we feel like that problem was rectified almost immediately.
That had to be something to do with the computer glitch. I mean, I'm not disputing what you're saying, but I am disputing that we neglected to log 600 calls. Being thrown under the bus, we might have to be in some things, but that is a glitch somewhere. There's no way we would call 600, it would take forever to dig up, or type up 600 calls to catch everybody up.
So I won't dispute what he's saying. I mean, he works in the EMS, and that may be accurate, may be a glitch. I'm telling you that when we were here and logged into Genesis, it was showing fewer calls than had actually been reported to have been run. So we recognize that as a problem. Our recommendation is fairly simple. It just says that there should be a process so that those calls are kept logged into the system on a regular basis. On page 34, in the middle of the page, to make a relatively short statement, this is under number 3. We were told by multiple sources that in terms of administration and management, that there was not enough communication taking place between the director, the deputy director, and the staff. There was no indication to us that there were regularly scheduled meetings that were taking place. It seemed to be more periodic or as needed. And we believe that your EMS would benefit from having a set recurring pattern of communication so that there's enough flow of information so that everybody understands what's going on, what the problems are that might have popped up, and how those need to be addressed. So again, not a major point, but something that we felt like should be included in the report. On the bottom of page 36, actually about the midways of the page, under C, number 1, with respect to clinical competence as it's listed there, we make a recommendation that your EMS protocols be updated. And it could have occurred since we were here, but every indication we received was that those protocols had not been updated in quite some time. You apparently have good medical direction. Your medical director indicated that he was more than willing to participate in that process. As we know, the care that is provided changes over time. Chris has already spoken about the fact that you don't have a training officer. It does not mean that your people aren't being trained, but it does suggest that there is an opportunity for a review at least, and possibly an update to your clinical protocols or your treatment protocols. So we make that recommendation. Then over on page 38 and 39, we address the subject of your ambulance billing system. You've had Ms. Kathy Lord doing that for you for quite a number of years. She indicated to us when we were here that she planned to retire in 2016. We've not conferred with her to know if that's still her plan or not, but we have made note of the fact that there's going to need to be a system in place so that when she walks out the door, you don't lose all that institutional knowledge. There are some alternatives here. You can hire and train a successor. You can, and we do make a recommendation to provide some part-time assistance to her in the interim. But if you can identify who it is that you want to do that job, get them aboard, let her help train that person, that would be ideal. Alternatively, there are a lot of private firms that provide that type of service, and I'm sure that they would be willing to engage with you in a conversation about what those costs would be and how the system would work. Then we're going to get you to backpedal to page 18. We've already spoken about your staffing model. Under your model, medics work 24 hours, and then they are on call for 24. On that second 24-hour period, they are paid at a minimum for 8 hours of overtime. Even if they don't get dispatched to a call, they're paid for 8 hours of overtime. It's a generous system. It is more expensive than it has to be, but it has bought you stability. It has bought you longevity. You've got medics who have been working for you a long time. They're clearly committed to you, and you've compensated them well in that regard. One of the recommendations that we made is to transition to a nominal on-call system of pay for new hires only, not for your existing medics. If you were to make a change like this, based on our calculations, that your existing medics would lose money, significant amount, over $8,000 apiece. We're not making that recommendation. We're recommending that if you want to run your service as efficiently as you can from a financial perspective, that you transition to a nominal rate of pay. We address this in significant detail in the report. By our calculations, if you were to make this change, you could potentially save over $78,000 a year. That's not an insignificant amount of money. Again, I do offer the word of caution. The system that you have in place has purchased for you longevity and stability. If that is more important to you, then you may want to continue with the existing system. If you're interested in taking a look at the nominal on-call system, then the figures are there to help you understand potentially what you would save. Any questions in that regard before I move on?
Well, I read, y'all can talk to me, I'm not going to talk to you about that. But does the other places that you go and you do these reports, does the director, does he work on call and run the ambulance and work his shift like everybody else?
It varies. Some do. It tends to be that in the more rural communities, the directors do get on the truck and full call.
I mean, they pull a full-time shift just like, I know some in other counties and places, they pull call, but they don't pull a shift just like every other employee does.
It's variable between systems. So I have seen even some smaller systems where they have a director by title as a salaried employee, but he pulls a shift every now and then. I've seen some where they are director and they have a regular pattern of being on the truck. And then when you get to your larger communities, typically the director is in a full-time management position and does not pull call unless there's an extraordinary circumstance. So there's no way to answer the question to say yes or no. It's variable between communities and the systems they've established.
So would you say that we're too small to have just a management director? That's what he does, nothing else. Would you say that we're
The amount of calls that we would get.
We did not attempt to address that question that way. And I'm hesitant to say that you are too small or just right to do it. Clearly, if you have someone who is devoted full-time to only management, they should have the requisite skills and knowledge and experience to be able to produce a benefit that is greater than the cost of having them in that position. We didn't attempt to quantify that. It's a question that I feel confident. If Gary, if you want to give him instruction to jump into that and do the research, I'd be more than happy. I'm sure that Chris would, to try to help you pull up the resources to come to a conclusion about that. From my perspective as a layperson, one of the benefits of having your director on the truck is visibility. Your community says, hey, there's my director. He's committed. He's out here helping. You maintain clinical skills. Even with 40 hours of training every 2 years, if you're not on the truck actually helping people, your skills are likely to diminish over time. So there's an advantage there of keeping your skills up. I wish that I could answer your question directly, but we did not approach it from that perspective. The last 2 points that we'll make is that we made a recommendation, this is on page 29, not really important that you turn there, but we did hear that in terms of your first responder capacity, we were told that fewer and fewer people are now able to get away from work and come respond as a first responder. So it suggests that there is an opportunity, if you can identify people who have the flexibility in their schedule and they can actually leave what they're doing and come to respond, that is something that you ought to take a look at. There's some description in there on page 29 and the recommendations about how that can work. There's some incentives that you could build in, but when something really bad happens, if you have a multi-car collision with a lot of injured people, or if you were to have a tornado or something like that, you need first responders to help you. You can't possibly staff up and meet that kind of demand without having your volunteers. So we make a recommendation that you take a look at possibly having more trained first responders. And then the last issue that we want to address tonight is that we were told time and again that there was either an actual or perceived lack of equity in the use of leave time. So your medics build up their leave time, they got vacation time, and then when they would take off, they're penalized for that. There's an explanation about that on page 35 and 36 in your report. In essence, what we have recommended is that if someone works for you on a regular basis, and they do, they work 24, they're on call 24, and they're off for 48, that means that they're working 91 days out of the year, in essence. If they have to take, or if they want to take a week off, they ought not be penalized for that. And so what we've recommended, and there's an explanation about how we get the math to work on this, is that if they take a week off, that they be compensated for what they would have earned in a typical week. In a typical week. So think about how it works. I'm on duty, I'm on call, I'm off 2 days. So you have this cycle that rotates through the year. It could be that my pay is a little higher in this section than it is in this section. But when you average it out, and it's easy to do, and the math is in the report for you to read, you can see that there is an equitable way to make sure that your medics are not penalized when they take time off of work. With that said, we think that you've got a good EMS system. It has apparently provided good service to your citizens. We do think that there are some opportunities to improve on the management of the EMS. We're confident that with direction that I'm sure you'll give to Gary, and we actually make a recommendation in the report to this effect, that he establish a series of goals and expectations for your management team, and specifically the director. And you lay that out. I don't know how you operate it in your business, but there are expectations of me. And when those are given to me, I intend to meet them. I have high expectations of myself, as I'm sure you do of yourself. So when you lay out the goals and the expectations, then you can start saying, okay, I met this goal, I checked that off. And there's a system of accountability. And we believe that would benefit your EMS as much as anything. But we do think that you've got a very good EMS. You've obviously got some good medics. They've been very loyal to your system, to your county. And we hope that you would take all the steps that are necessary so that the system remains strong financially, that it remains strong from a personnel perspective, and it continues to be respected in your community. If you have any more questions for me, Chris, we'd be glad to answer them.
Are you going to address the day truck? to
Yes,
some
sir.
degree?
I will. It is addressed in the report. There's extensive documentation about the day truck on the front end of the report. It really gets into the discussion starting over on page, looking around page 9, 10, 11 through there, and it gets into more specific detail as we get on over to page 12 and 13. Every calculation that we made, and this was based on data that was available to us, and some of it was cash expense data, cash receipt data, some was audited financial figures. The day truck did not make money. It did not make money. And when you look at it on a per call basis, it looks really good because you're collecting a lot more money on a per call basis. But it wasn't staffed in a way that it can make money for you. If you could figure out a way to run that day truck, and I say day truck as in dedicated for the transport of patients that are not here. They're not 911 calls. This is to go to the hospital and pick someone up and take them to another hospital, pick them up at the nursing home and take them to the hospital, those types of things. When you look at the data, it showed that the receipts were nearly 250% higher than for 911 calls. There are reasons behind that. There's documentation in there in the back, under all those tabs that supports this, and the narrative supports it. But if you could figure out a way to staff so that you only had people available for the time you needed to go make those transports, you can make money. But when you staff full-time, round the clock, you can't make it work. It will not work. The data's there. I'm sorry that I didn't address that. I should have. It's a very substantial part of the report. There are multiple pieces of information here for you to review. But that day truck did not make money. Mr. Chairman, that's the report that we want to present. We do appreciate the opportunity to be here. If there are any additional questions, we'll be glad to address those. Chris, you got something you want to chime in?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I'm going to leave you with extra reporting for your convenience.
And just so you'll know, Chris will be sending to you, maybe even as early as tomorrow, he'll send it to Gary and Sherry. But we're going to send you an electronic copy of this report. That way it'll be available. If somebody wants to do an open records request, you don't have to print a book with 100 pages in it. You'll be able to forward them a link or a file so that they will have access to that.
And I will send that to you tomorrow, along with a draft copy of that job description for you, field training officer as well. We don't charge a fee for coming down and conducting this assessment. The only reimbursement that we do request, if a member of our assessment team is not a state employee or employed by ACCG. In your case, we did have one member of the team, and I think y'all provided him reimbursement for his nominal travel and some meal reimbursement. So, with that being said, in exchange for this report, which I think is a very good report, I'm going to ask that if you think that this report has value to you, if you think that the recommendations that we make in that report is going to help improve your operations, both economy and efficiency of your operation, I'm going to ask if you would just communicate a letter to my two bosses, Dr. Pat O'Neill, who is the director of the division of the Georgia Department of Public Health, and I've got his address and his email address. Keith Wages, who is the director of the state office of EMS and trauma, my direct boss, and then Ross King, who is the executive director for the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia. If you would communicate any correspondence to them, I'm not telling you that you have to, I'm just making a request for your consideration.
Are you asking Gary, or are you asking each one of us once we read this?
I think on behalf of the
Gary,
Deputy County Board of Commissioners.
Can we give him feedback that we have?
We signed one letter, and we signed it, or something.
Yeah, you know, the team, and especially Dave Wills, invest a tremendous amount of time in preparing this report to you. So just your consideration. That's all.
Y'all have any other questions for me or Chris?
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
help.
you for coming.
You're welcome.
Good to see you again.
If there aren't any questions, I know you've got another meeting, but if you don't mind, I've got 130 miles to make, and he's got a lot further than that. So we would like to be excused if you don't mind. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate
I'll
it.
be in touch.
This meeting is adjourned. We're gonna call this meeting to order, this regular monthly meeting.